Good, we're good. So welcome to our sustainability panel this morning. Thanks for being here. My name is Emily Chen. I'm Managing Director for Originations for the National Equity Fund. We are partnered with many of you in the room to finance affordable and supportive housing nationwide. So happy to be here to moderate today. So we have a wonderful panel with us. I'm going to do a quick name introduction, and then each of the panelists will do a more talk a little bit about their work as part of their presentation. So, New York State is a leader in addressing climate and health issues so that we can create a healthy community for all those that we serve and for the community at large. And so the sustainability issue is top of mind, and the state has put forth a lot of resources to back up their policies in support of the work that all the folks on this panel do and all of you do as well. So I'm just going to turn it over and do a quick, again, introduction. We have Samantha Pearce representing the New York State Home and Community Renewal. We have next to her Jennifer Leone, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer for the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development. We have Anthony Piscopia, who is a Director of Housing Preservation at Magnusson Architecture, and Jerry Mascuch, who is the Vice President of Real Estate at Samaritan Daytop Village. I'm gonna just kind of roll with it. So we'll start. Should we just kind of go in this order? Does that work? Yep. All right, Samantha.
Great. Thank you.
And I would just ask folks hold their questions. So the format is going to be the presentations, and we'll do Q&A after. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. I feel like I would be remiss to say, I feel like even a few presenters after, it's really hard to follow that amazing keynote. I feel like ALOC was very inspiring for me personally and really made me reflect on how I personally think about sustainability. I've sort of always thought about it as just doing the right thing, just build a smart, good building with good material that's, does not leave a negative impact on our environment. So I think sort of reflecting on that speech and thinking about that is a nice way to frame, well, what is sustainability and why do we care about it, right? Just thinking about it as best practice and what we should be doing as business as normal. Obviously, there's policy that goes behind that, which I'm going to get into, but really just reframing, not that sustainability or caring about the environment should be something different, but just what we do to protect ourselves as humans and to show love for where we live, right, and respect for where we live. Okay. So the policy side of things, why we're sort of here and why we maybe with a stick need to care about this work a little bit more. In 2019, New York State passed the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which said that as an entire state across all sectors of our business, we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by at least 40% by 2030 and at least 85% by 2050. These are really big goals that also include sort of supportive goals around that larger mission that says we also need to ensure that we're implementing renewable energy into our grid, meaning the power that we use from electric needs to actually be sourced from wind and solar and ground source energy and shift away from our traditional power plant structures. So when we think about what a greenhouse gas reduction means for buildings, it really means that we need to remove fossil fuel burning equipment. This is removing natural gas, removing fossil fuel oils, petroleum, and things of that nature. Those are things that we burn on site traditionally to create either steam or water that heat the spaces that we live and occupy. And really the reason that we want to do that is because when those things are burning in our facilities, they're releasing greenhouse gases, which impact our environment. And so the Community Protection Act is really one of the most, if not the most, robust package of comprehensive, cross-sectoral targets to really, as a state, look at not just our buildings, but our transportation and our grid systems. And so in December 2022, the group that was formed as part of the CLCPA, called the Climate Action Council, created a scoping plan This plan outlines by sector what we need to do to actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so the pie chart on the left here, my left, your right, illustrates the entire state's greenhouse gas emissions as of 1990. And if you notice that yellow chunk there, which says buildings, looks like it takes up a lot of that pie chart. That would be correct. Buildings is the largest greenhouse gas emitter across the state, meaning coming in at just about 31.4% of the New York State's greenhouse gas emissions. Of that, about 60 to 70% of that comes from space heating. So when we talk about what do we need to do to reach these states' broad and lofty goals, you can see that obviously focusing on our buildings is an important component to that. Within the scoping plan, we outlined in the buildings chapter, among other sections, which include environmental justice and just transition, meaning there's focus on how we transition our workforce away from these fossil fuel equipments as well. But in our buildings chapter, it really focuses on the need to electrify our building systems, meaning remove those fossil fuel systems and install systems that use electricity to heat and cool spaces. And so that is typically done with a product now on the market, which hopefully many of you have started to hear about, which is called a heat pump. Think of it like an air conditioning unit that also does heat. So it uses that same technology where it extracts temperature from the air rather than pumping in new temperature. Overly simplified version of what it's doing. But it's kind of like a refrigeration cycle that works in reverse and in forward. So we could potentially be providing for our environments both heating and cooling, which I think is a really exciting, positive part of what this plan is. So we released the scoping plan in December 2022. In Governor Hochul's State of the State address in January 2022, she announced a sort of supportive target to reach 2 million climate-friendly homes across the state by 2030. This initiative really is illustrating the need to focus on buildings and housing, and specifically in housing, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in our housing stock. There's over 6 million homes across the United States, and of them, about 60% of them were built before there was an energy code. So we have a lot to do in our existing housing stock that we'll get into in a little bit more detail throughout the presentations. So at HCR, sort of jumping ahead really quick, sorry, I did a lot of framing there for the panel. At HCR, we took this scoping plan really seriously, and we introduced a set of sustainability guidelines, which are required for any project that's seeking financing through our 4% or 9% tax credit program to comply with our design guidelines, which now include a set of sustainability guidelines. We released this graphic, which shows the trajectory that we're on in terms of updating our requirements over time between now and 2050, ultimately, to align our goals and what our baseline standards will be in alignment with what the CLCPA is requiring. And so what are we doing to help support, right? We're setting these goals. We're saying you have to do this. We obviously need resources to be able to support that requirement that we're now asking of all of you all in this room and others to achieve. So we introduced our Clean Energy Initiative, which is a program in partnership with NYSERDA, where we take NYSERDA's ratepayer money and we put it in the capital stack for you so that you don't have to do a separate application to NYSERDA for incentives around clean energy work. The Clean Energy Initiative program is a $100 million commitment to fund both work in new construction and existing buildings to cover expenses of reaching passive house standard and in existing buildings for replacing equipment. We also most recently released our Climate Friendly Homes Fund, which is a state-funded program through HCR that's going to provide $250 million for specifically 5 to 50 unit buildings that are in decent condition, not going through rehab or refinance. And that will fund up to 10,000 units in the next 5 years at about $25,000 a unit for the cost of installing heat pumps, domestic hot water heat pumps, and some minor building envelope improvements. And then at HCR, we also run and are continuing to expand and leverage federal dollars within our weatherization assistance program. This is really critical work that serves the electrification ready market. We have to make sure in this whole trajectory that we're not just installing heat pumps and changing out equipment, but that we're improving health and safety conditions and basic building envelope conditions, meaning we have to have a good, well air sealed sealed building before we put in electric heat pumps. And then we're also really focusing on technical support with our partners at NYSERDA. And so just a little bit of detail here on that Clean Energy Initiative program, and I want to be respectful of time so my colleagues can present here. This is just sort of available on our website, but a roadmap that we have 3 different term sheets for our Clean Energy Initiative: existing buildings, adaptive reuse, and new construction. And as you can see, those fundings range from $5,500 a unit on new construction to up to $25,000 a unit for existing buildings when you're financing projects with us, either subsidy only or tax credit. Our existing buildings CEI program specifically has 3 buckets where you choose your own adventure rather than a certification pathway. So you choose your scope goals, and then based on which scope goals you choose, that's how you get up to the $25,000 a unit. And then finally, on the Climate Friendly Homes Fund, just a little bit more detail. It's going to be issued as either grants or loans. This is so that it can work in your existing deals. As I mentioned, this is not a program that's meant to be paired with refinancing or other sort of major capital work. You can combine the Climate Friendly Homes Fund with other grant-based programs like Weatherization Assistance Program and other sort of incentive programs, but not other loan or mortgage products. And the hard cost funding per unit is about $18,000 to $22,000 a unit when you subtract out the soft costs that the program is covering, like auditing and technical support during the program. We are not funding in the Climate Friendly Homes Fund solar, deep health and safety needs, or other outside energy efficiency upgrades. So this is really for those buildings that are in good condition that just want to electrify their heating systems. In order to get enrolled in the program, you have to have a successful audit that shows your building is in good condition. But it's a great opportunity for those smaller buildings that otherwise are harder to reach through incentive programs. And we're excited about that. And then finally, just a little bit more detail on our Weatherization Assistance Program for anybody that might not be aware of it. It funds up to about $8,000 a unit on average, and that is it's not a grant or a loan, it's a service delivery, meaning there's a network of contractors that do the work, so the owner does not have to put up any money. The work is paid for by the contractor from us directly, and the work scopes typically include air sealing, windows, sometimes ventilation improvements or replacements, and we work in both single family and multifamily, so there's no sort of unit restriction, and we work in any multifamily building where at least 50% of the occupants are 60% AMI or below, which usually is all of the supportive community, so usually no issues there. And with an additional $289 million that we just received from one of the last stimulus packages called the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, we are expanding our program by almost double over the next 4 years. So we are really looking for more buildings to help serve and get electric ready. With that, I'll pass it over to Jen. Which one's your Jen?
That one.
There you go. And then you just have to hit that button.
Sorry, I am not used to a ThinkPad. All right. So my name's Jen Leone from HPD. Thank you, Sam, for that amazing setup. I'm going to leap into things more pertinent to New York City, starting with Local Law 97. So Local Law 97 was released in 2019. I hope everybody has a good idea about Local Law 97, given that it's been 4 years since the law passed. But for little background context, Local Law 97 is a greenhouse gas emissions reduction law that will get the city to a point of an 80% greenhouse gas reduction by 2050. For New York City, 2/3 of our emissions come from buildings, and a huge focus of the law is existing buildings because in 2050, 90% of the buildings that will be in New York City then are already built now. So that's just some background context without the important graphics, but we are here talking specifically about affordable housing. The rules for affordable housing are a little bit different for Local Law 97. For most HPD projects in particular, most of our buildings, because they include rent regulation, are subject to what we've been calling the prescriptive path. This means by 2024, buildings have to implement certain prescriptive measures or meet 2030 emissions limits. And that represents a huge bucket of the work that we do. A lot of buildings and projects that people in this room are working on are probably subject to that. There's another path for buildings that have less than 35% rent-regulated units and some other, or that aren't regulated otherwise, that are subject to greenhouse gas emissions limits starting in 2026 and with reduced emissions every 5 years until 2050. And then another bucket that affects affordable housing, income-restricted buildings. It's a lot of HPD Mitchell-Lamas, which may not be applicable here, and a lot of HCR projects, I believe, that don't have to start complying with emissions limits till 2035. I put this graphic up because we have guidance. We've co-created guidance with the building department, and it's a reminder to folks that we have a lot of this information on HPD's website, and that's where you can go to find out what bucket your building might be applicable to. A couple things that are important is the prescriptive measures pathway, again, because it affects so many buildings, is a series of 13 measures that have to be done where applicable in buildings. And I listed them out here, and a little chart just to show what the cost impact of meeting this compliance guideline might look like. Another point of reference, because people ask, how will buildings that are trying to meet the 2030 limits do that? And there's just a couple of example scopes on here for anybody who's not given this a lot of thought. For buildings that aren't doing so bad compared to the 2030 emissions limits, it's really maintenance, low flow fixtures, and low hanging fruit. A big middle bucket of buildings will have to do a little more work, and it's the kind of work that Samantha was talking about, like electrification readiness work, really. Roof insulation, air sealing, and just general investments in existing systems. And then finally, the worst buildings will have to start stepping into what I call like electrification light, so that they can start meeting these emissions limits. And that might be true, that might not be in 2030, but will be in subsequent deadlines. The most important thing I can say about Local Law 97 is around affordable housing, especially the rules have not been released yet. So we're still kind of waiting until we know what's going to happen with that. They're expected to come out in 2023, and they'll talk about the rules pertaining to penalties for noncompliance, penalties for failure to report, and some other clarifications that we care about. There may be some alternative compliance pathways and relief for buildings, so we're all waiting with bated breath for that. Anyway, that's really important. I wish I had more to report. We thought we'd have rules by this event. But now I'll talk a little bit more about our programs. Like HCR, HPD has design guidelines, which are geared toward not only decarbonization and aligning with the city's climate goals, but also we have design guidelines that focus on health, safety, equity, and resiliency. HPD recently released, really for the first time, preservation design guidelines earlier this year. And later in June, we'll finally release new construction design guideline updates that really put a focus on decarbonization more than we've ever done before. I'm not going to dive in deeply, but just some of the key criteria across our different design guidelines focus on building performance, resiliency, and we're getting really serious about flood and heat resiliency in New York City, but also health and wellness and safety and operational considerations and broadband. So just, you can read about them in more detail. I don't want to go into great depth. How are people going to pay for this? We don't have the same kind of program that HCR does, but what we've been doing to solve the really big challenges of high performance and electric buildings is we've released 2 pilots. We have a pilot called the Retrofit Electrification Pilot, and the team for Samaritan will talk about one of the first projects in that program. And that funds electrification on projects in HPD's retrofit and preservation pipeline. And it covers heat pumps, it covers space heating, hot water, and all of the associated measures that we expect a building to do in conjunction with building electrification. That pilot is going strong right now. We've closed one project. We have 2 closing this week and another handful closing this summer. So that's pretty exciting. And we just launched a new construction housing initiative, which funds all electric passive house buildings. Also, these are applicable to projects in our new construction pipeline. The details are on our website. I won't go into depth there. What's really important about our pilots is that a lot of this, especially around building electrification, is new. And it's really, really hard, especially on existing buildings. So our pilots are based on the idea of predetermined and really smart holistic building scopes that address decarbonization and health and, building health as well. And again, similar to HCR's program, the money flows directly to building owners, although through NYSERDA, not through HPD. But with the goal of really streamlining incentives and providing really hefty incentives for this challenging work. And finally, there's a huge amount of capacity building that we think is important. There's technical support to our teams, a lot of resources we put up on our site for anybody to use about how to electrify, tenant resources, maintenance requirements, and so on. And ultimately, there will be a lot of data and lessons learned generated from the pilot. Just to recap, these are 4 of the 15 projects that are currently in our retrofit pilot pipeline. And you can see that we're touching rental buildings, co-op buildings, supportive buildings, and so on. All of them with really different considerations for building electrification in terms of billing configurations, who pays for heating, who pays for cooling. And there's just so many different considerations that the pilot is able to see, like bird's eye view, how this is really playing out on the buildings we have in New York City, and we'll have a whole lot of data to understand how to do it better in each subsequent round. Just a little outcome metric. I said close projects 3. That's because by the end of this week, there will be 3 with 153 dwelling units. Our current pipeline right now has 26 buildings with almost 1,000 units, and we still have plenty of room for additional projects to come through. Couple other resources, I'm gonna just talk about them really quickly, but we've been really focused on the building electrification and all the subtle and important pieces that building owners are going to have to know about to implement electrification. We have a webpage about our rules, requirements, our electrification M&O standards, utility allowances. We've been doing all that background work so that electrification is actually viable on that side of things, including HPD's electric heating policy, which lays out the rules and requirements about when and what kind of equipment you can have, who can pay for heating, how we can deal with utility shifting, and so on. Here are some of the pilot tools and resources that we've put up on our website, publicly available for anybody doing building electrification, technical requirements, FAQs, tenant resources, and so on. And then just some outreach coming out that we've been doing around our pilots, our design guidelines, and local law 97. I just want to call folks' attention to our work with the New York City Accelerator and KC3. They are downstairs, I think, if anybody wants to talk to them about building electrification. And this includes related incentives that we're working on with them and Con Ed, and just general outreach and assistance in meeting local law 97 requirements and direction to other programs. And finally, more and more outreach and presentations to folks about decarbonization, local law 97, and so on will be coming online predominantly through our friends at Building Energy Exchange to help folks learn about all of these programs, policies, and so on. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Tony, who hopefully you'll hear a little bit more about our pilot from.
You will. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Jennifer, for that wonderful introduction. And I'm sorry I missed the keynote, but it sounds very, very exciting, and I'm going to have to catch up on my notes on that. I work for MAP, which is Magnusson Architecture and Planning. We are a purpose-driven architectural firm that specializes in affordable and supportive housing and senior housing, as well as community facility spaces and community-based planning projects mostly. Almost all of our work includes nonprofit developers or not-for-profit developers, social service providers, and so our approach centers largely around the quality and the way, as a way of helping, our clients deliver a mission, their mission to their clients, which is an inclusive environment in a dignified space, and basically to foster a sense of pride of place for people sometimes often who've been through a shelter system or who've this is their first permanent housing. So it's very rewarding, I find, intrinsically when any of our new buildings are occupied or any of our existing renovation projects are filled. I had as she mentioned before, I'm the Director of Housing Preservation, so I deal with almost all the renovation projects in some way or fashion in the office. And I was driven to this office because of their work in sustainability and largely the lessons I've learned from our Director of Sustainability, Sarah Baya. This, in the middle slide, you'll see, is the building that HPD was kind enough to select as the first pilot project for electrification. And the exciting thing about it is it's a renovation of a 1920s building, a 5-story walk-up building that's now going to be electric heating and cooling, electric cooking, an elevator where there wasn't one, and basically engaging the building and the residents to their community, which is not uncommon with other projects that MAP has done. So MAP's preservation work is always growing and is targeting interventions to improve buildings, performance, residents' comfort and health, and save on energy and operation costs. And decarbonization of existing buildings is the only way that we're going to reach climate goals to avoid worst impacts of the most vulnerable population. Understanding that even the DOB recognizes there's about 1 million buildings existing in New York City as of, let's say, 2 years ago, and that just keeps growing, so that we need to look back at these older buildings that do have life in them and put in new systems that are more efficient. So to that end, Director of Sustainability Sarah has worked on a NYSERDA retrofit project, which basically mapped out all the different tools that were possible to attain, reduction in energy use in various forms. And the reason why you have to look at it in various forms and you look at all the various tools is not everybody's budget is the same, not every building is the same. I bring to the table my knowledge of the different genres of building through the decades and what that may require to make a tighter envelope. And then what we look at is what systems best fit those buildings, and then what systems best fit the budget that our clients may have to still gain some sustainability and basically reduce energy usage. Some of these EUI indexes shown here, like 24.6, 29 and 69 show the difference that you'll reduce it depending on the amount of tools that you use to attain it. Obviously, overcladding puts the insulation on the outside, but that's not always the way that someone attains it. And these EUIs are without the solar calculated. So the office is basically has 5 core principles that deal with any new building and any renovation, and that's basically trying to get continuous thermal insulation, air tightness, energy recovery ventilation, efficient electrification when we are doing that, which is often on renovation, and healthy building materials. And that's really very critical. So while there's a bunch of different ways to do it, we've settled on these 5 core principles that basically apply in retrofit or even new construction. This slide is appropriate to several renovation projects, including the one that we're doing for HPD with electrification. First slide shows the wall and the exterior wall where there was a wood furring on the outside of the brick, and basically that wall just is meant to breathe. old school design. First thing you do when you go in is consider air barriers on that inside surface and redoing the wall. We also showed some buildings in the 60s have these sleeves through the wall, and budgets don't often allow you to put new equipment in, so filling those tightly with rock wool insulation, sealing the outer panel, and then sealing the inside basically drops the air infiltration in an apartment and increases the comfort level of residents inside a building. The more extreme version is the one on the right, where you can see the evidence of moisture getting in and out of the building and its damage on the exterior, and changing the heating and cooling system in that building and the windows greatly improved the comfort level and the efficiency of the building's operation and its energy usage. It's better detailed. So you need air sealing. That's the most important thing that I think you can do. And then there's the analysis for insulation. And without the air sealing, you're basically going to have moisture passing through the exterior walls, bringing damage, it'll damage the wall as well as cause mold and mildew. And so what ventilation traditionally is you suck all the heat out of the building or the bad air out of the building, and with that, you're basically, in these older buildings, you're pulling in air from the outside through leaky walls and whatever materials those walls have, and from the corridors and from neighbors' apartments. And so basically, it's not a very healthy environment, not really very conducive to pandemics as well, because you're just pulling air from every apartment and every hallway, and it's negative pressure in a building. And this also contributes heavily to moisture problems. So you'll see just by that one building where we changed the exhausts and did ARVs on those existing exhausts, we affect that tremendously. And so doing that is not the only tool we use. You then have to be very mindful of the materials you put in the building so that you do not increase the amount of off-gassing materials that people are breathing. Often we deal with clients and their clients who basically have pulmonary diseases or asthma and have been living in situations that do not help their health. This is a way where you can really affect it. And one of my great experiences walking in one of our new buildings done from the street in the Bronx and feeling like I was breathing fresh air when I walked in the building rather than when I walked outside. And that's really a noticeable improvement. You sense that, anyone can sense that. This is our Wakefield Apartments electrification. And while this project for Samaritan Daytop Village is really two buildings, one with 54 units and one with 72, the one building that really met the threshold to do electrification is this 5-story walk-up building that was bifurcated, meaning there was 2 sets of stairs, a wall between 2 halves of the building. This basically is electrifying heating and cooling and electrifying cooking. And that's a very important, simple step that one could do, because even though it does take an electrical upgrade, it really takes putting pollutants directly in someone's apartment out of the equation. Yes, you can burn food on the range, and that's not healthy, but you're not burning fuel that actually contributes to that unhealthy environment. So when electrifying, the big question is, how do you handle the heating and cooling, and how do you handle domestic hot water? This renovation only has heating and cooling and the electric cooking. But it has the capacity in the future to convert, let me go back a slide. It has the capacity to later electrify the domestic hot water. So there'll be really high efficient gas heaters, not boilers, heaters that create hot water and store it in the tanks. And as I see in the last 5 years, the systems that create domestic hot water are becoming more compact, more affordable. So it's very likely that within 10 or 15 years, there'll be a very economical way to convert that gas-fired hot water heater to electric, which is then we'll have a total electric building, which basically isn't compliant with the 2050 goals. This is another way to do that we've looked at in the past and didn't consider. It's not part of the electrification pilot, but I think what it shows is that you can't just look at one way to do things. You have various building types, and various conditions, and so you really need to think out of the box on what you're going to do heating and cooling electrically. And these are not outrageously expensive. I mean, the electrical upgrade is one thing, but even in buildings that need an electrical upgrade, you could service that unit from a raceway and basically accomplish heating and cooling per apartment with individual controls. I'm not going to get into the metering because we were fortunate our client and some of our other clients are doing master metering. I think it really is healthy when you do heating and cooling to do that because the environment it's just getting hotter. So I think you want healthy environments, and that's part of the package. On the left, just on my right, you'll see a unit that's incremental. It's a heat pump again with a condenser that goes in a sleeve. So sometimes you don't fill those sleeves with insulation and seal them up. Often it's out of the budget to basically put brick back in it, but that's why we went the other path. But this is a path that shows us using a unit that fits within that penetration that was already in the wall, improving the air sealing, improving the windows, and doing it local at the window wall. The other picture shows you a typical split system with a cassette on the wall or close to the ceiling. This is an interesting renovation, and I'm throwing it in there because it's a 1913 building that had an oil burner that delivered steam to radiators. And it was renovated in maybe 1999 to have a water system, so it has fan coil units. And unfortunately, as an architect, if you want to do things sustainably, you really do need to get into your mechanical engineer's head. You just cannot avoid it. So, and it's the right way to do it, to be sure that what you're looking at will really do the job, fit in your building. So here we saved a lot of money for the client and still got NYSERDA incentives. We were one of the last Tier 1 multifamily incentives because we kept the cold and hot water lines that went to the fan coil, but we got rid of the gas-fired chiller and went to an electric heat pump chiller. So we would deliver refrigerant down and then goes to the hot and cold water that goes to the fan coil. And basically by changing the windows and air sealing the window installation, changing the fan coil unit to one that doesn't require outside air mix, and using heat pumps, we've basically electrified the heating and cooling. The owners had just installed some gas-fired hot water systems, so we kept the gas hot water heaters, and then we were changing them to more efficient ones, but we kept that mode. They also, because of the electrical upgrade to do the heat pumps, will have the capacity in 15 years to basically make their domestic hot water electric. There were 20 apartments, 2 floors, 40 apartments in this 146-unit building that were on gas cooking, and we electrified that, so the entire cooking in this building is now electric. So that really works because this is a supportive housing building on 165th Street in Broadway in the Heights, and has a very important clientele that many are veterans, many have asthma, many basically have aging in place, and so we amplify the aging in place requirements for our apartments in addition to the percentage to make them fully mobile. So I think that all in all, it's very rewarding for me, even though it doesn't have a great new architectural piece to it, it has a lot of intrinsic reward. This is the latest and greatest version of what we're looking at and excited to explore for buildings built in maybe the 50s, 60s, and 70s, where you want to do unitized heating and cooling. It removes the refrigerant line traveling up and down a building and delivers it from the outside unit to the inside unit. Not as pretty on the outside of the building, but we found a way and a model that actually looks a heck of a lot better than an air conditioner sticking out a window, because this one fully integrates and it puts the noisy and unhealthier portion of the equipment outside. It also allows you to have individual thermostatic control, and actually it gives you the ability to replace it. You're not replacing a boiler. If one apartment loses a unit, you go downstairs. If you've got a few extra, you should have attic stock. Replace it with that one, send the broken one out for repairs. So again, that's because it's a large site, and there's a lot of apartments. We looked at it and how the best way to basically do electric heating and cooling. And that this really works for this particular development. I won't say where it is, but you'll see the picture. We changed the window. We flipped this over the wall. You have to have a window that opens at least 16 inches so that this device can actually hinge and go down. So we really got into the weeds on how you're going to do it and why the window had to change. And then we took it as an opportunity to make a better window next to the pair of windows. And by doing a casement, we further reduced air infiltration. This is one project where we are definitely putting the air barrier, the vapor permeable air barrier on the inside of the masonry. And the insulation is up for grabs when we figure out the woofy. This one will also have domestic hot water, but let me jump on because I think we really want to see what's happening with the electrification project. Again, this is electric cooking. The most efficient way to cook is electric induction, whether people like it or not. It's the most direct contact between your pot and your heat source. There's a bit of degree difference between the space on a flame and your pot, so you are losing a lot of heat when you cook on gas, much as we all seem to like it. I'm converting. I'm definitely going that direction. I have one place that way and one the other, and I'm moving to electric. So it's more efficient, and by taking those pollutants out of the air, you're helping people with asthma and pulmonary and cardiovascular diseases. And these are the people that we serve and our nonprofits serve. People who just need a better environment. So this is the electrification project we're working on with HPD and with Samaritan, and we're very excited about it because we breathe life into this 1920s building. And you can see that's the courtyard with 16 steps up to the entrance. And the courtyard to the right to your right is the proposed courtyard, dead level with sidewalk, walk right in, and basically circulate in the building. So what was before is you walked up the Chichen I used to call it, and then you get in the building. On one, you hang left, you hang right, two different buildings that was separated. And so it made the building sort of like who lived in the east wing, who lived in the west wing. So we basically are making it accessible by taking out the courtyard and thankfully not hitting rock when we did it. And so there you see the circulation pattern coming up. See the central corridor, which brings light and air into the new corridor space. And that's the circulation now. So you come in grade off the street, you can access the elevator at that level, and then you circulate both sides of the building. Now this helps operation, it helps people in the building for accessibility, their visitors, and it also helps managing the property because the condensers are all on the roof. That was the building before. It was a very carved out entry, and what happens now is the entrance faces the street, so you not only make it accessible, but it's re-engaged to the community and accessible to visitors as well as the people who live there. The new environment, basically we took over the boiler room for the tank room, we took over the oil tank room to make a laundry room, we managed to have bicycle storage in here, and of course, thankfully, we're able to get incentive money from HPD towards the electric heating and cooling. So that's an immense advantage, and there'll be community facility space that Samaritan will run, as well as their social service space. We even wove a compactor into the space that leads down to the side entrance on White Plains Road. So this particular site is 1 block away, I believe, from Mount Vernon. This is what we'd like to do when we can, and I think we show this is because, modeling helped, testing helps, and basically monitoring the actual usage. And so I think what it points to is that you need to look at all the tools available, and you need to look carefully at your building. We were fortunate these buildings had, in the middle of Bushwick, had truss-shaped roofs, so it was very easy to figure out how solar would work without enhancing the structure, and that was the edict we got from the client. If I have to do anything structurally, it's not going to happen. So we did the analysis, it was worth it, and we were able to get 5 kW of solar. Not every project can do that. Electrification doesn't ask you to do that, but I think keep your mind open to all the tools out there and watch what happens in the industry, because the equipment is advancing, it's becoming more efficient. And I'm happy to say that I actually see the grid is getting clean as I drive way up North State. Many wind farms, many community solar. This is happening on 1,000 acres. So there is a cleaning of the grid, if not an improvement of the grid. So I say, look at all the tools and look at your building closely. I'm going to turn it over to Jerry Maschuh, thank you. Aside from being fortunate to have Jennifer Leone and HPD involved in the electrification pilot, we basically were fortunate to have a client who was willing to consider all this and who didn't want to own another falling apart building in the middle of the Bronx that serves people who are formerly homeless. So I think with that in mind and that mission, I'm going to introduce one of my favorite clients, Jerry Maschuh from Samaritan Daytop Village.
Thanks, Tony, and Jen, and Samantha, Emily. Hi, everybody. Jerry Maschuh, worked for Samaritan Daytop Village as their Vice President of Real Estate. I don't have any slides, so I'm going to try and keep it brief. These guys talked a lot about the technical aspects. I'm going to try and cover more of the experience as a developer, owner, manager of housing, and how electrification kind of works with that. Samaritan Daytop Village is a 60-plus-year-old multi-service agency based in Queens, but we have locations throughout all 5 boroughs, as well as Rockland, Suffolk, and Ulster counties upstate. We do residential treatment programs, outpatient clinic, senior center. We have a large transitional housing footprint in New York City with 32 transitional housing residences. And we do permanent supportive housing through master leases, as well as we recently have gotten into ownership and development. And that's what I'm going to talk about more today. I've been working in New York City's affordable housing industry since about 1990 or 91. So I've seen the kind of supportive housing grow from the SRO providers, which really started as moderate rehabs of old SROs in New York City, to where we are today with beautiful buildings with cutting-edge design, a whole industry of architects and experts that are committed to providing permanent housing for homeless and special needs populations. Right now we have this two-building project in the Bronx that I'll tell you a little bit about. It's called a cluster conversion. These were buildings that were operated as, sorry, I'm just going to skip a few things. It was operated as a cluster site shelter under leases between New York City and not very good landlords. And the city purchased a portfolio of these buildings and then turned them over to nonprofits like Samaritan Daytop Village to begin a process of stabilizing them and renovating them. So the two-building project is a occupied renovation. And so as we look at a project from the development side, I wanted to run through some of the things to consider as you're thinking about a project. I think first question is, why do sustainable? And there's, two major reasons for me as a developer. One is, we serve the whole person, and we look at social determinants of health. So we really, from a mission standpoint, we want to build a healthy environment that supports people and helps them recover and helps them improve their lives. And so having a healthy environment to live in, and especially if we're building and developing properties in communities that have not ideal health outcomes for people related to asthma, as Tony mentioned. And so having better indoor air quality is a very important issue to address. Plus, in looking at the Bronx building, just by doing a renovation, a standard renovation, you're you're greatly improving. We were starting from a very low sustainable, you can't even say sustainable, because oil heat, very neglected buildings, lots of plumbing leaks, roof leaks. So just by doing standard renovation work like new roofs, new windows, we're greatly improving. And where we have kind of gone above and beyond that is electrifying the stoves and looking at the electric heating system. So when you're looking at a project, a renovation or a new construction project, I think the first thing you have to consider is your development team and identifying architects like MAP who are very committed to sustainable practices. And also, another key is identifying other consultants. Because as you can see, there's a lot of very technical aspects. I'm more of a generalist. I'm not a technical person. I'm a real estate person. So I try to assemble a team with those expertise. So a good architect and then a sustainability consultant who can help you comply with the latest incentives and help you get those incentives. And so when you're putting together your development budget, make sure you have adequate funding for a sustainability consultant. Make sure you include things like commissioning, because this equipment requires commissioning. Like on the Bronx project, we have a $60,000 commissioning cost that, 10 years ago, that cost, I never saw that on a development budget. Now that's something that, is in every development budget. Another development challenge is some of the incentives. I think HCR and HPD are looking at ways to improve upon this, but a lot of incentives come in very late in a development process, so you don't get those funds until construction is complete. So, and those funds are for construction often, so your lenders want you to guarantee those funds. So something you might have to consider is pledging a portion of your developer's fee at the initial construction closing to guarantee those funds until you get the incentive. The upside of that is sometimes you assume a lower incentive and you're actually eligible for additional incentives, so it creates a little bit of its own contingency account for your project, which is helpful. And as you're, the other key person or key consultant or team member to consider is your general contractor, making sure they have experience in these sustainable design elements and that they're subcontractors. Often the manufacturers or the equipment requires that the installers be certified in certain equipment, so making sure that your scope includes all of those requirements and that you point those out to your contractor and make them acknowledge that they see that they're in there so that you're not arguing about it halfway through the project. And then also, if you're working with NYSERDA or other funding sources, just making sure you're anticipating their requirements as far as like requisitions during construction. One thing on our project is these, the VRF systems have a lot of equipment that needs to be purchased by the contractor. So, lenders never enjoy paying deposits, but that's something we negotiated with our lenders, is to allow us to give the contractor deposit money so that they can put a deposit and get the equipment lined up and at a price that's current. So after, the other thing is to be mindful of schedule, especially when it relates to, in New York City, Con Edison, if they have to do street work or anything else to upgrade your service, that can have very long lead times. And so the other thing from a budget that's kind of an annoying budget factor is, these are occupied buildings in the Bronx, and we have like a bunch of Con Ed accounts, but with the new service, they're requiring deposits. So, even with multiple existing accounts at the address, we still are paying, not huge amounts, but it's like $10,000 in deposits that we didn't anticipate. The other thing, and particularly if you're looking at occupied renovation, where we're checkerboarding tenants in order to do the scope of work, just things like refrigerant lines that have to be tested. It's a complicated process in getting back in and running those lines from the roof down to the first floor, and then ideally you want to test an entire line. So doing that, moving tenants out of that line and moving them back and getting completely done, we're actually still figuring that out. So that's something to keep in mind if you're doing a checkerboarding occupied renovation. And then I'll finish with just some of the operating challenges. One is, these new systems require staff training. When you have a commissioning process, when the construction is completing, you're starting up your new equipment, that's an opportunity to have your staff, your building staff participate in that commissioning so that they get introduced to all the equipment. Realistically, you're not going to find, I don't think we're going to find staff that are experts at these systems yet, unless we're paying double the salaries we can afford to pay to our maintenance staff. So another key thing to do is make sure you have good maintenance contracts on the equipment. In addition to the first year, but beyond the first year of operations. And then focus for your maintenance staff, focus on really clearly defined maintenance schedules. Like there's a lot of filters with this equipment that should be changed that didn't exist with just your old oil boiler. So just making a schedule and making sure your staff that doesn't have the technical skills but definitely has skills to do that. And then on the tenant side of things, we haven't completed this project, but in past job I had, we did a heat electrification in a new construction project. And one of the things we found with the tenants was we had to educate them around efficient heat, especially because the traditional New York heat is, you just crank the heat up, and if it gets too hot, you open your window. And so we went from, people went from living in that environment to an electric heat system that had, sophisticated thermostats where we as a manager could even see what the temperature was in their apartment from off-site, but it was too cold. And they would call us and say, it's cold in my apartment. We'd look and we'd say, no, it's 70 degrees in your apartment. It's not too cold. And they would disagree with us. And so brand new building, we had multiple 311 calls. And 311, so HPD kept coming out to the building due to heat complaints and kept not finding any violation, but they kept coming. Finally, I talked to HPD. I'm like, there's no violation. Do you still have to come out? They're like, yes, we have to come out. We get a call, we have to come out. So that's just something to keep in mind, working with your tenants, trying to get them to understand that, in the winter, 72 degrees, 68 degrees is what we're required to deliver. These new systems can actually deliver pretty precise temperatures, but you might not be able to walk around in your underwear when it's 10 degrees outside. The other issue is that Tony alluded to is master metering versus individual meters. On our renovation job in the Bronx, we're master metering those, so we're paying those utilities, and we're underwriting based on estimates that we got from our sustainability consultants. On the former project I worked on, the electric systems were heat and air conditioning, so as a landlord, we're required to provide heat, but we're not required to provide air conditioning. So we had a very complicated metering system where we actually had a third party that did the billing for us, and so during cooling season, we would bill the tenants for the air conditioning. If anybody's collected rent, you know how challenging it is. Collecting electric charges was challenging as well. And so you get into the next cooling season and you look at a tenant's account and they owe you $500 from last season. So as a landlord, you can say, I'm not going to turn your air conditioning on because you didn't pay for last year's air conditioning. But then that family has medical needs and there's extreme heat. So, what are you going to do? Not give them air conditioning? And I think as we face climate change and extreme weather, air conditioning is really becoming as important as heat in New York City summers. So I think to sum up, I think we do it from a mission point of view. It's the right thing to do. It's just irresponsible to build new building or renovate a building in this day and age and not do sustainability. And finally, we're required to do it. So, it's the right thing to do, and you have to do it. And 2030 is like tomorrow. 2050. I've been doing this work long enough where I closed deals in the 90s thinking, oh, who cares? 30 years, and now I'm like I've refinanced some of those deals. So. I'm not going to be working in the industry 30 years from now, but 20 years, not that long. So 2050, 2030, those are right around the corner. So, thanks.
So thank you to our panelists. So we have about 30 minutes for questions. I have a quick follow-up for the group, and then I will let everyone raise your hands to ask this very knowledgeable group of folks. But it's more for our agency representatives. What we just heard Jerry talk about actually is you have this great, sort of mandate, mission-driven mandate for sustainability, and there's capital resources to support it. But then for ongoing operations, I heard, maintenance, operations, education, tenant education. What's your guidance, or are there resources out there you can point to for our operators of this housing to make available so that they can make sure the operation side of things, stays as current as possible?
You can start.
So I think the one, from a personal perspective, in a former job, I ran a program that was specifically around operations and maintenance, and that's really near and dear to my heart. I also was director of senior housing for about 1,200 units and worked with my supers day in and day out in the residence. So I'd say this with personal understanding of how important this is and actually getting it done on the ground. There are definitely not enough resources in the market on this topic, but I will say the tides are changing. And so there's a lot of new programs that are coming around and new technology that really can empower, anybody in maintenance to be able to visualize how their systems are performing. So first and foremost, I think installing, when you're doing these equipment renovations, installing equipment that allows you to actually see on a computer screen wherever you are or on your phone, how your system's performing, super key to operations in the ongoing. Not only can your maintenance staff see it, but your management can potentially see it. A third-party consultant that you might want to hire to help support that can see it. I think that's a huge step. And then there are resources, Jen mentioned New York City Accelerator. There's resources through community development groups that there's the what are they called? Oh my gosh, the name is escaping me. NYSERDA the Clean Energy Hubs, sorry. There's clean energy hubs that NYSERDA just formed around the state, which are community groups that are specifically tasked with helping to empower people across the state to understand what resources are available to them. So I think we're gonna see more come around that, and TBD.
And yeah, I would say that those are all true, and I think from the standpoint of both of the agencies, we're trying also internally as we require this kind of equipment, making requirements about operations and maintenance procedures. And we have a lot of links, I know, in our design guidelines for where to find free staff training. We've been providing a lot of resident resources because, to Jerry's point, we need residents to understand how to know if their systems are working, right? First stop is let's stop getting complaints and explain what you should be feeling with your heat pump. I know the first day I moved into my apartment and I'm like, there's cold air coming out of my unit, you know, and that would have been a 311 call if I hadn't figured out that, oh, actually my apartment's warm enough. It just doesn't feel right. So I think making sure those resources are there. I also know that, you know, we work closely with HDC on our maintenance and operations standards, and we've given a huge amount of thought to how to integrate appropriate standards for the operational and energy side and maintenance side of new systems so that building owners, even the ones doing the best practices with staff and residents, like actually budget their projects from the outset and understand what it's going to take to operate these buildings.
Thank you. And just one more question about best practices. Tying back to some of what Jerry was talking about, and actually for the whole panel, is, you know, how do you layer all these resources together, right? So you're, you know, and from those, because you see a lot of projects come in, what are some of the best practices around, you know, how do you research this with the teams that you need to bring on board? How do you put the best stack together to make these projects happen?
Is the mic on?
Um,
Okay. Well, I think, you know, bringing in, you know, good consultants and learning from last projects. So like the cluster conversion in the Bronx is funded primarily by HPD, as the other cluster conversion projects are, along with CPC is the bank lender. It's like a participation loan quasi model. And then we, because we wanted to do some additional work, we also submitted an application to HHAP and got a $3.5 million award for that we kind of justified putting in the new elevator and the electrification pilot came along, and we were considering that work anyway, so it made sense for us to apply for that. And that's a $1 million grant towards the project's construction, and that's, you know, it's pretty much covering the electrification costs. You know, the electrification costs are, we estimated about 1.3 million, so it pretty much covers that because you know, we had funding for HVAC systems anyway. So, and then in addition to that, we're layering in NYSERDA and Con Edison incentives that should be about, you know, $300,000, and that's coming in late. So we had to kind of guarantee those funds, but we're confident we're going to get those. We actually, you know, we assumed about 80,000. We think we're going to get about 300. So that's that kind of contingency piece that I mentioned, it's the incentives are, maybe they're calming down, but they seem to be constantly changing. So we work with Bright Power as our consultant, and you know, their proposals are great, but they're like, you know, 20 pages because they have all these contingencies. They're like, right now you're eligible for this, you know, but in 12 months they're coming on this new program, so you have a lot of contingencies. You know, if we do this, we'll do that. You know, if the program changes, we'll provide this in order to get you that incentive. So it's kind of monitoring that, budgeting for that. You know, my idea with a consultant, like a sustainability consultant from a development perspective, is like, if you can get me an incentive that pays your fee, that's good with me, because I'll, you know, and then I can make a little more. So, you know, it's kind of a self-funded budget line, and there aren't many of those. So I think that's the key, having consultant, because I can't keep up with the sustainability issues. So I think working with an architect who is committed to the work and is knowledgeable about it, and then having additional sustainability consultants that are, you know, on the cutting edge of it and that's what they do for a living. They keep up with it every day.
Thank you.
MEP works closely with many of the sustainability consultants. I think that that's a really key important thing. I think maybe if the system for affordable housing allowed for some pre-development dollars for the developers, once a pre-closing commitment that allows them to really explore this, so it offsets some of that cost, because you'll never get one that's going to basically get you as much incentive as their fees are costing, because all these things have a lot of metrics that you have to basically show proof of, especially when you're going through NYSERDA and they use Con Ed and Con Ed use Wildan. I think the kickoff meeting was about 17 different people with all the different consultants. I mean, we got through it, we did.
Great, thank you. Let's open up to the audience. So, Greg?
So, Greg Marr from the Leviticus Fund. I had a question for you, Jen. I'm wondering about an affordable housing owner who currently owns a building, and they do the energy emissions upgrades by 2024 to meet the 2030 standards, if I'm understanding it correctly. So they're the example from the fine schedule under Local Law 97 in that case? And if so, for what period of time?
That's a good question. So there are not 100% clear rules on this that are published yet. But as we understand this, if a building is subject to that prescriptive pathway, which also allows meeting the 2030 limits by 2030, if a building maintains its status as an HDFC co-op or more than 35% rent-regulated units, then that is a one-and-done compliance requirement. But we believe it's contingent on the building's affordability status. Does that make sense?
Yes, but if they're not doing a wholesale electrification of heating and cooling, then they may not have an incentive in the future in terms of, I guess, a stick incentive to do that down the road.
So according to Local Law 97, that's true. There is no incentive down the road to electrify or be fully decarbonized, but there will be other laws. Any laws could change. If it does happen that laws that terminate the ability to use gas on equipment replacements, like that's been discussed at the city and state level, if that happens, that effectively does the same thing, right? When my equipment is at its end of life, I no longer can put fossil fuels in, and I need to be thinking that way for the future. It's inevitable that electrification will happen by some piece of law at some point. That's my opinion. It seems
Yeah,
like
it's in
it
the
would be
state
impossible.
legislature already. It's happening, so. The new construction one already passed, so.
Great.
Hi, I'm Jeremy Sand with Capital One Bank. I have another question concerning operations, and this time operational costs. As there's this greater and greater push for electrification, this is not the first time the state has done this, but it had to back away from its previous attempt because of electrical supply issues, as I recall.
Jeremy, do you mind just speaking up a little bit?
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So as more buildings electrify, because I know personally, and I live in a single-family home, so it's a little bit different, but with no change in electrical usage, my bill has gone up by about 1.5 times over the last 2 years. So do you have any thoughts about the operational cost of electricity as both the supply becomes more, not constrained, but more in demand, and then the demand charges will also increase? Like, what effect, or what thoughts do you have on controlling the operational cost of that for these buildings that have completed decarbonization projects?
So one sort of big picture comment on that, and I'll let folks dive into the details, is that there's a really interesting pilot that just got kicked off in the last legislature session, which is a pilot program that for any project that is electrifying with specific NYSERDA programs such as Empower and possibly expanded, but right now Empower, that the utility price an LMI household would pay would not exceed 6% of their income. Any utility cost over that would actually be subsidized. So if, for instance, if their 6% of their bill is 60% of their income a month would be $60, and they get a utility bill for $100, they would still only pay $60, and the state would subsidize the $40. So we're testing out that parameter to do some control on homes that are electrifying in the LMI community. It's not going to be available to everyone, as I mentioned. It's a pilot, but I think it's a really innovative way of ensuring that our LMI households aren't the ones stuck with, oh, now my bill is higher. The other huge component of this is that when we all sit here and talk about electrification, which we say all the time because that's like our go-to word, it has to be with improvements to building envelope and air sealing to reduce the total load of the home first and foremost, so that we are hedging against volatility of rates, which we have less control over. As the grid continues to work and DPS is working on, bringing in wind and solar, the hope is that there will be some idea of either a fixed rate for homes that are electrifying so there's less volatility. Those are all sort of conversations in the works, but not really yet.
And just to add a couple more things, because all of that is really the baseline for this discussion, but focusing electrification on buildings where it makes sense. I mean, both of our standards for existing buildings are like, let's not go after the buildings where costs will go up. Let's focus on oil. Our pilot focuses on oil and electric resistance buildings. That's a starting point. And if anybody's tracking utility costs, it's not just electricity costs that are going up. Oil peaked at like $5.63 a gallon in the past year. So when you look at those costs, it's outrageous. And as the fossil fuel infrastructure starts to diminish, those costs are, they're going to have also negative impacts. So you got to think, sorry. Thank you for that disruption.
Sorry.
But anyway, you got to think about the whole picture, right? Like the what if I don't is also going to be impacted that way.
Great. In the back, actually.
Hi, my name is Michelle Real with the Rise Community Partnership. I wanted to talk a bit more about like tenant buy-in and kind of that engagement with tenants and like with all these new things that are being added in their homes. One of the things that came up, I guess it's like sort of like a lack of resiliency plan, but with electrification of all these buildings, like what is the plan? There's a fear of like power outages or fear of like buildings just not having that kind of old school way of operating like the gas stove and stuff. And we're not going to put like an oil generator on a building. So can anybody speak to that in terms of like resiliency, emergency plans?
First and foremost, most, I will say most because I don't want to say all, most gas stoves do not operate when there's a power outage because they have an electric pilot.
Right.
So I get it. Maybe you can like jerry rig an unsafe way to turn it on, but like you should not. There are definitely stove options being developed in the market today that will actually have a battery built into them and can work for a period of time. But the bigger sort of high level answer to, I think, your question is, again, build a well-sealed building envelope. People can shelter in place even without heating and cooling for longer periods of time. You keep the heat that's in, and you let the air that's out stay out. So that's sort of like baseline principle of resiliency for these like high performance buildings. And then if you do have things like backup power through solar or other options, there's like potential for on-site energy depending on the type of, I know there's issues in New York City with battery storage, but outside of New York City, there's like battery storage solutions with solar that are viable. So.
And we, both agencies have been focusing on enhanced resiliency for more vulnerable populations, right? Seniors or, other populations where it'd be really challenging to leave your building during an extended outage, right? Low mobility populations and so on. And also a focus on place of refuge, right? If you can't heat your whole building during a power outage, can you heat some parts of a building to make sure that people are safe from, thermal issues?
Yeah, I think you all talked about thermal improvement. That's important. So that's we did roll this idea out to residents. We did have a meeting with residents. And the myth on the cooking issue really is sort of a myth because it's far more dangerous to deliver gas lines up and down a wood frame building that's built in 1926 than it is to deliver electric cooking. And I think that many of the residents at the cluster buildings had that firsthand experience because one of the buildings not getting electric heat had gas cooking and it got shut down because of the tremendous amount of leaks. So I think that there's a health portion to that that's important. Yes, we do have the gas for the domestic hot water, which sort of helps at least if you cannot get, you know, if there were a power failure and we have a really tight building, at least you're gonna get hot water out of the system that doesn't require electric to ignite because it has a generating turbine inside. But the point is, if you've ever, you know, you really have to look at these things very carefully and predict, but, you know, making a decision not to electrify and the fear that the grid's going to go down is not really the right path. But we did roll out many of the residents, well, like they thought one resident said he thought he hit the lottery. He was just hoping that would really happen, that they would have air conditioning, cooling, you know, air conditioning, heating, and an elevator. So I think that really felt very good. I just hope that feeling lasts for us, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, one thing that happened recently was not a resiliency question, but it's more typical than I wish it was, but you know, tenants a source of fire is leaving something on the stove and going to sleep, or, you know, walking out of the apartment even. And so we had that happen just a couple weeks ago at a building where we had electrified the cooking, and the stove got hot enough where it tripped and shut off. And if it was a gas stove, it would have just kept burning. And so, you know, the fire department said, you know, thank God it was an electric stove. It shut down. There was damage to the apartment with smoke, but it was limited to that apartment and wasn't major. So the other thing I want to add is, you know, the heat pump systems are multiple pieces of equipment on your roof. So you might lose heat. If you have a technical problem, you might lose heat in some of your apartments, but usually don't lose heat in the entire. This isn't like a storm-related thing, but like if you have a maintenance problem or something breaks down, it's limited to a few apartments. That if you're sealed and the apartments next door are getting heat, you know, you shouldn't have a dangerous situation with cold. So there's, you know, there's plus and minuses to that. You know, you might have to do more maintenance on it, but your entire building won't shut down. Like when your traditional boiler shuts down, the whole building loses heat and hot water. With these systems, you can lose like 9 apartments or at a time maybe, but you can, you know, replace them or get them repaired. And I think the repairing and supply of these pieces, this equipment and these systems is getting much better because, you know, up until a few years ago, they were all over Europe, but not many of them in the U.S. But that's changed and is changing. So,
right. And this particular installation was more incremental, less centralized. So it's like Jerry says, it's a line of apartments being fed from that condenser. It's not multiple lines, and so you know, you could look at systems that do it on a broader base. So you not only have to worry about the loss of a power, but the loss of a piece of equipment. So by doing a sort of hybrid decentralized system like we have, at least we can control where the issues are, and the parts are more modular and easier to replace for those units. So a lot of went into this, and I have to say it was very helpful that HPD engaged Tandem Engineering and other partners in the TAP group so that we had a built-in best ways to do things and a successful outcome based on real science, and hopefully the metrics will prove that.
Great. And there's a question here.
I'm Elliot Hedderly. I work as a project manager for Settlement Housing Fund. My question was similar to the previous question about increasing demand and costs. I was wondering if the agencies are thinking about or would even consider advocating for transitioning to a publicly owned rather than investor-owned utility company, which will do a lot more to actually control affordability and volatility as opposed to just subsidizing the cost for LMI households. This would really be a solution across the board to keep costs under control.
So there's a really interesting structure in New York State, which is that while Con Ed and other utilities are privately held and have shareholders, they're under the oversight of Department of Public Service, which is a state entity. So they have to follow those rulemaking decisions. So there is some oversight and guardrails that can be imposed of any utility company that which is in that market. This excludes municipally owned utilities, of which Long Island and a few small little locations like Bath, New York, for example, are outside of DPS's oversight. All that to say is that DPS is working very closely with their partners on the utility and with NYSERDA to think about a fixed structure rate. Some of these ideas that have been floated around that are not anything that's happening, but that are being discussed, are a sort of time of use rate or a heat pump rate. So if you are on a heat pump, you would have a fixed rate rather than a floating or volatile rate. There's lots of discussions around how to protect the LMI community from a rate structure perspective. So DPS is working on that based on the structure. I think there's some other really interesting things that are happening around thermal energy networks, where there's some new pipelines being installed. Thermal energy network basically is like a really fancy term for like pull the heat and the energy out of the ground and transport it rather than like make it. And so there's some really interesting things being done there. Some that are being privately developed and then will feed into utility companies. So there's a lot happening in this space, but that's like.
Great. Any other questions from the audience? In the back, Liz?
Hi, Liz Oakley with Magnusson Development. This has been a great panel. Thank you so much. It's great to hear the clusters. It's a historic, terrible thing, and it's now a bright green future, which is great. My question is, where there are so many options now, how did you decide at Wakefield to do the electric heating and cooling, but not the hot water? I was just curious, when you're looking at your options, how you arrive at that.
I think, in the 3 years that we started the project to planning, right, and going up there to see leaks, we might have reversed or changed that decision today, to be honest with you. And that's why I say you need to keep keep abreast of what's going on in the industry, because that would plug into the equation. Now, even when I show the slide of the NYSERDA retrofit, there were only 3 options. Today, if we embarked on that, Sarah might come up with 5, and one of them would definitely be a different way to do the domestic hot water. So I think that was the real reason. We do have the space to do it if we wanted to, but I think it didn't fit in the budget at the time. But moving the clock 3 years forward, it would be considered very likely now.
Were we concerned about Con Ed's ability to, because we were,
Yeah.
while we were in design development, we were electrifying the stoves in one of the buildings because of the gas leaks and the gas got shut down. And that was not an easy process with Con Ed, so
Yeah,
I was
that's
a little
how-
gun shy, like, are we gonna be able to get that done? So that might have been part of it, but I don't know.
That could have been, because it soured our taste for actually increasing that even more in that building. Though I have to say, in the other building where the gas went out and we went to electric stoves, we are doing things to improve the steam system in that building and actually have gas-fired heaters there that are highly efficient and using COSA units. So even though we couldn't get an electrification incentive, that didn't mean we abandoned the thought of being very sustainable in the other building. And fortunately, Jerry and the client was very involved in us doing that. And so you do need to fit it in at this point. I would not knock it out of your equation, domestic hot water being electric.
Great, thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Actually,
Last question.
yes.
Sorry. Samantha Delgado from Tampa. So it was mentioned that there's going to be around 1 million buildings within New York City. So where is the infrastructure plan so that the electrical grid can withstand the million buildings?
So New York City is actually, and Con Ed's grid, is actually on what we call a summer peak, meaning the highest usage of electricity happens during the summer months. If we electrify at the rate we're electrifying today, we wouldn't meet that summer peak in the winter until like 2035. So there is, meaning like the grid has a max capacity. That's already happening in the summer. And when you electrify buildings with cooling, it actually reduces the load. So while the heating load is increasing in the winter, the summer is actually slightly decreasing because they're more efficient than a traditional AC unit. So all that to be said, utilities have a plan based on the rules of the Climate Action Council to increase their infrastructure. And so when you look at sort of the math all together, as we start to electrify and potentially hit up against a new heat winter peak, the grid will be making its improvements to increase its capacity and infrastructure. That's the plan.
Great.
That's a really good answer.
Yes, it is. It's a very good answer.
All right.
I had the same
What,
question.
one last question over here. Thanks.
Are there any incentives for using geothermal cooling and heating and hot water heating as well?
What are they?
Yeah, are there?
Are there?
Incentives
Oh,
for using
yeah.
geothermal
They're federal ones, I believe.
cooling
Yeah.
and also hot water heating, because now we do hot water using the geothermal.
Really short answer from me and then Jen. The IRA has really great new tax incentives for
Yes.
geothermal, so I recommend looking into the tax code that was part of the IRA package for that incentive.
And the city does not have anything like that?
Well, the Clean Heat Program is continuing to fund geothermal, the Con Ed Clean Heat Program, so that's one source.
Yeah.
And then the federal tax credits, and
Yeah.
I don't know of any more that are specific to that.
Yeah, I don't think there's any in New York City, but the federal one is the best one.
Right,
to look at
geothermal is a
first.
part of the IRA, it's included. Yeah.
You're doing that.
All right. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you for being here, audience. Thank you so much.